With the permission of the doctorate board and in order to obtain the degree of doctor from Radboud University Nijmegen, I would like to defend in public my dissertation entitled A Journey from Clinical Data to Clinical Care for Anorectal Malformation Patients Across Europe and Australia, Methodological Implications of Registries and Epidemiological Comparisons. And I think I can speak for most of you that when you received this book of mine or the digital version, that you already choked on the title. So I'd like to explain my PhD and this whole journey that I've gone through in layman's terms, in regular terms, by dissecting the title. So first of all, anorectal malformations, what are those? So anorectal means that it involves the anus and the rectum is the last part of your bowel, so this part of your body. A malformation is when the part of your body doesn't look like or doesn't function the way that it's supposed to. So anorectal malformations are malformations of this part of the body. Now, they can be, for example, where the rectum, so the last part of your colon, doesn't end where your anus is, but ends before that, so between, in this case, the vagina and the anus. And this is called a perineal fistula. You also have where, for example, the rectum ends even closer to the vagina, or in boys, where the rectum ends in the urethra. These are 3 common types of anorectal malformations, but you have many more types. Now, anorectal malformations are very rare, and they occur in about 1 in every 2,500 to 5,000 babies. They require highly specialized reconstructive surgery, and these children often have a temporary stoma until they're old enough for the reconstruction. They frequently have other associated malformations of the body, so malformations of other parts of the body that are associated with their anorectal malformation. And this condition often affects quality of life in patients from infancy into adulthood. And you should think about things like constipation, continence, sexual and mental health later in life. Now, clinical data, what do I mean with that? You should think about patient details like the sex of the patient, the year of birth, the type of anorectal malformation, other malformations of the body, did they undergo surgery, this kind of data. Now, what are registries? A registry is a system, for example, a database that holds or collects information. It's usually for evaluations, like for conducting research. It contains observational data, so no experiments, and it's about a particular disease, and in this case, anorectal malformations. It often looks like this, which you might recognize like a database. And because it's a database that usually is online, that many people can enter patients into, you can have multiple hospitals entering data. You can even have multiple countries, which leads to a lot of patient data in there and better research. Methodological implications. This is a difficult one, but it's not actually as difficult. It's more so, if you want to collect that information, do you have clear definitions of the information that you want to collect? What type of questions do you want to ask to gather this information? Are the answer options, if it's for example, multiple choice, are they correct answer options? Is all of this user-friendly, or is it way too difficult to enter all the data? These kind of implications. Then epidemiological comparisons. Epidemiology is the study of how diseases are distributed in terms of person, place, and time in a given population. And in this case, what types of anorectal malformations do people get? How many of these patients undergo surgery? And if so, what type of surgery? And then comparisons answers these questions between different groups. So for example, between boys and girls, between how old or young they are at time of surgery, and, for example, between Europe and Australia. For the remainder of this presentation and also the public defense, I will refer to, and I think many of the people in the room will refer to anorectal malformations as ARM. Now I will go into the 4 parts that comprise my PhD thesis. The first part is about the key components, challenges, and quality measures for rare disease registries and contains chapter 2 and 3. Part 2 is the clinical and surgical characteristics of ARM patients in Europe and Australia and contains chapters 4, 5, and 6. Now, part 1 looks mostly at the structure, and in part 2, I mostly looked at the data contained in the registries. Now in part 3, kind of combined these two and created a novel registry, which is described in chapter 7. And then part 4 is the general discussion of these 3 parts and the future perspectives by the end of this PhD thesis. So first I would like to go into part 1. And part 1 contains chapter 2 and 3. And as I said, in these 2 chapters, I looked at the structure of rare disease registries. In chapter 2, I looked at the structures described of other patient registries in the literature. And in chapter 3, I described an existing registry, the Anorectal Malformation Network, the ARMNet registry in Europe. This is a big registry that contains currently over 3,000 ARM patients and is with 34 centers in Europe. I found from the literature that most articles focus on the design of registries, but less so on data quality or sustainability of registries. And within the ARMNet registry, I found that there were discrepancies between users. For example, if one user would enter data of patient A and another user would enter data of the same patient, this data was not the same. I also found that, for example, if one person would enter data from patient A and the same person would enter data from the same patient later on, even that data was not the same. So these kind of discrepancies. I also found that completeness was sometimes an issue, and there was lots of free text. So surgeons would love to write all kinds of stories in the database, but that's difficult to analyze. Then part 2, like I said, focuses more on the data inside these registries, and specifically the ARMNet registry. So chapter 4 describes the characteristics of over 2,600 ARMNet patients. In chapter 5, I delved deeper into these patients and into this data and looked specifically at the complications after surgery. In chapter 6, I compared the patients of the ARMNet registry with patients from the Royal Children's Hospital in Australia. And I found that data from registries can indeed be used to describe clinical characteristics. And I found that the most common patient is the perineal fistula, so the one that I described first, the first figure, with malformations of other parts of the body. I found in terms of complications that certain patients or certain factors had led to a higher risk of developing complications. So more complex ARM types, for example, the one where the rectum ends all the way in the bladder, very complex type, has higher risk of complications after surgery. Also, if a patient has malformations of other parts of the body, this is a risk factor, and undergoing laparoscopic surgeries. I also found there were more complications after a divided type of stoma, even though the majority of these patients actually had this kind of stoma. Now, just briefly, there's 2 types of stoma, a loop and a divided, and this is the one that I'm talking about. Then finally, chapter 6 compared the characteristics between Europe and Australia. And I liked to compare the characteristics between patient characteristics and treatment characteristics. And I found that generally patients between the 2 regions were similar, even though Australia did have some more complex types, and they also had more patients with malformations of other parts of the body. Other than this, they were quite similar. However, in treatment, they definitely differed. And Australian patients more frequently had a stoma, and they also more frequently underwent laparoscopy, but they did not have more complications after laparoscopy, as was seen in the ARMNet registry. Now, taking what I learned from the structure in part 1 and the clinical value of data in part 2, I established a new registry for Australia and New Zealand, the Australia-New Zealand Congenital Colorectal Registry. This registry contains patients with anorectal malformation, but also other conditions such as Hirschsprung disease or chronic constipation. And the ANS core, as we call it, is a big registry where the central registry is in Melbourne in the Royal Children's Hospital. And then you have healthcare sites of all the different states and New Zealand entering data from their specific hospitals into the central registry in Melbourne. And then finally, the general discussion and future perspectives that are at the end of this PhD thesis. So I found that registries are a good solution to conduct research in rare diseases. I found that the majority of ARM patients have associated malformations of other parts of the body, and should therefore be screened for these type of malformations. Also, very importantly, collaboration is key to achieve research of good quality and improve clinical care, especially in the field of rare diseases and also anorectal malformation. Complications vary per region, and they were often varying based on how often the surgeries were performed. So surgeries that were performed more frequently in one region had less complications, and vice versa in other regions. Now, just to philosophize about new ideas at the end of this thesis, I was thinking about it might be an interesting idea to go towards automatic data collection. And for example, those discrepancies that I described earlier between users, those might become way less because of this automatic data collection. I also would like to look at risk factors for longer-term complications like incontinence or constipation, and obviously quality of life later on in life, as I said before, because this condition affects patients throughout their whole lives. And finally, I think it'd be really beautiful to see exchange programs between regions to improve surgical skills, so that those complications that we saw that varied per region might be reduced. And these are some pictures of, on the left, Melbourne, in the middle, the Waalbrug here in Nijmegen, and on the right, the Bloemgracht in Amsterdam. And having presented my summary of my dissertation, I return the floor to the rector.